Our campus conversation, Awakening Our Democracy Beyond Me Too. And it's a conversation, as you know, that focuses on sexual harassment, on gender, social change, and the future. We have an incredible panel here today, whom I'll introduce in a moment. But first, a quick word about the Office of University Life and about the Awakening Our Democracy series. So the Office of University Life, as hopefully you know, is a hub for university-wide student life information and resources, and for university-wide campus conversations on pressing issues like the one we're going to have today. You can check out the University Life website, the University Life app, and all of our social media for a lot more, including about after today's event, the live stream of the event, and also coming events. So today's conversation is part of our flagship Awakening Our Democracy series, and it's a series that is designed to focus on disparities and justice issues. And certainly Me Too and what's beyond Me Too is top among these today. Maybe you became familiar with the phrase Me Too via activist Tarana Burke, who is credited with first having used it over 10 years ago in connection with support for victims of sexual violence. Or maybe you learned about it as a phrase highlighted by some of the founders of the Time's Up movement, the actors and writers who've worked with that. Maybe you've seen its power in more personal accounts, or less publicized. Maybe you've used it yourself. Me Too, what we can all know is Me Too, and what we can all recognize is Me Too and the stories that it has surfaced have created a new surge in attention to sexual violence and harassment. Some would say have rocked the conversation about these issues, perhaps changing it forever to come. And it has also raised many questions, and thanks to those of you who submitted questions for our panelists today, I'll just share a few. One, what concrete differences has Me Too already made? What might it make in the future? How can we understand the Me Too movement in a global context, given that there have been very positive reactions in some places and quite negative reactions in others? Should we be concerned about people rushing to judgment based on a social media post? And how can this make a difference in the lives of students, both while you're here and beyond? I'm honored to introduce our fantastic panelists to get the conversation started to help us think this through. And I'll start at the far end with Professor Melissa Murray, who recently served as the interim dean of Berkeley Law School at the University of California, where she regularly teaches family law, constitutional law, reproductive rights and justice, and criminal law. Professor Murray's award-winning scholarship focuses on the roles that criminal law and family law play in intimate life, including marriage, sex, and sexuality. And we're also delighted and fortunate to have her here at Columbia this semester as a senior fellow and visitor with the Columbia Law School Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. Sara Ziff is a magna cum laude graduate of General Studies here at Columbia. In 2011, she founded the Model Alliance that I'm sure she'll tell you about. She works with designers and industry leaders to establish fair industry standards in the fashion industry. And I've had the good fortune of working with Sara and the Model Alliance on some projects related to this. Sara has also worked since the age of 14 as a model, including for Tommy Hilfiger, Stella McCartney, Kenneth Cole, Prada, and many other brands, and has co-directed an award-winning film about her work in modeling and fashion. Abdul Staten is a prevention coordinator in Columbia Health Sexual Violence Response Office. He's a trained facilitator in bystander intervention and has worked to raise awareness of and address toxic masculinity, sex trafficking, and exploitation. Abdul is a member of the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault and previously managed sexual violence programs at Trinity College. And next to Abdul is Professor Katherine Franke, who is among the nation's leading scholars in feminism, sexuality, and race, and is my colleague at Columbia Law School, where we co-direct together the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. Professor Franke is also a member of the Executive Committee of Columbia's Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and the Center for Palestine Studies, and in her spare time, she teaches at a medium security women's prison in Manhattan. And of course, we're honored to have back again, the second time in the Awakening Our Democracy series, Juju Chang, Emmy Award winning, who is Emmy Award and many award winning. Say more about that in a moment. Juju currently anchors ABC News' Nightline and reports regularly for Good Morning America in 2020. In her extensive career, Juju has won every award that I've ever been aware of that a journalist and anchor can receive, and probably more than that. And really, after today's conversation, I encourage you to Google everyone, because I've just given you a snippet of all of the incredible things they've all done. So the format is Juju will moderate the conversation for some time and then turn to all of you students in the audience for questions and more conversation. Let me turn it over to you.
Oh, Suzanne, thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be on the stage with everyone. Thank you for setting the table so beautifully. In the most recent 6 months to a year, I've done a variety of stories about Me Too, everything from interviewing Harvey Weinstein's accusers to sitting down for a long conversation with Rose McGowan, and looking at a lot of the peripheral issues and movements that have sprung up around Me Too. But I wanted to launch today's conversation with just your observations, whether they be academic or personal or whatever, about the Me Too movement and where it arose and what, if anything, you took away from its inception. Melissa, why don't we start with you, since you have a very historic perspective.
I don't know if I have an historic perspective. I'm trying not to remember that I'm 40 and 40 plus at this point. But it does feel like it's an unusual moment. Sexual harassment has been around for a long time. In 1991, I remember watching the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas controversy unfold on television. So this is not the first time we've had a high-profile sexual harassment scandal. But I think what is different about this moment is that, one, it's unfolding in an array of new media, social media that we haven't seen before. And the immediacy of that new media really makes this really different. And perhaps more far-reaching than even the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas episode. One of the things I think social media does in this moment is allow victims who generally have to come forward alone, and it's incredibly isolating to do that, to now actually stand as a collective and maybe have their experience slightly anonymized, but also projected in a way that highlights the universality of what they've experienced and gives them a little cover as well. So I think it's a particularly interesting moment, and one that is really bolstered by the advent of these new social media tools.
And we know that the hashtag literally generated millions of responses, and so this idea of isolation, was wiped away. Sara, your thoughts?
It really feels like this is the first time that women are being believed. We all know that this problem is nothing new, but somehow it seems that we have permission to talk openly and fearlessly about sexual injustices. And for me personally, I got chills when I read Jodi Kantor's piece in the New York Times about Weinstein. Since October, it's been life-changing for me in my work as a labor activist in the fashion industry, because I think I've gotten a lot of eye rolling, and people sort of think that standing up for workers' rights for models is like something out of a Zoolander skit. But I work in an industry where we know probably better than anyone that appearance matters, and it affects how you're treated. You know that if you're a young woman who gets unwanted sexual attention, and you know that if you're Black in America. And so for the first time, I think that it feels like my work is being taken seriously, and we're allowed to try to address these systemic problems.
I think it also triggered a lot of people to share and dig deep on emotions. This weekend I was in Los Angeles for A Wrinkle in Time, interviewing Oprah Winfrey and Reese Witherspoon and Mindy Kaling, just to drop a few names. And Oprah and Reese had that moment where Reese Witherspoon was getting tearful, thinking about the Harvey Weinstein allegations, and Oprah said to her, "You act as though you have PTSD." And I think there was a similar sensibility with a lot of people around this conversation. But Abdul, I want to bring you in as well. Thoughts, observations?
Several, but I'll try to be concise. So speaking of Reese Witherspoon, right? So one reaction, one person I do have is when we look at this on a day-to-day level, when we look at survivors and victims on a day-to-day level, typically survivors aren't believed, right? When you contrast that with celebrities such as Reese Witherspoon, when they come forward now, they are believed, right? And so for me, on a ground level, working with survivors, it's tough knowing that the folks here at Columbia, when you come to an office to get services, that you might not be believed by your peers. However, online, online, people, your peers or family or whomever, might also praise the Reese Witherspoons of the world, and rightfully so. The tenacity and courage and strength that she displayed is worthy of praise. But so too is the Columbia student who comes forward to say, hey, I've been assaulted and I need services, I need a class change, I need what have you. So that's one observation. And then real quick, another observation is how men are responding, if you will, to Me Too. Some have tried to do some introspective work, which is a step in the right direction. However, others have lashed out. And so scores of women are being believed, which is great. But then there is some backlash from some pockets of men, name calling and making threats and a whole bunch of debauchery, for women coming forward. So that's also both a good as well as a stark reality.
Interesting.
For some of us, this feels like Me Too too. Because we came out in a different way a number of years ago as lesbian or gay, where we were closeting, secreting a shameful thing about ourselves and had to come forward, and a social movement was built from those acts of coming out at great risk and fear of rejection. And so in this time, I'm sort of reflecting on, are there similarities between coming out as gay or lesbian and coming out as someone who's experienced sexual harassment or assault? To what extent is that closeting that we've had to bear similar, and in what ways are they different? And I think one of the ways they're different is today's Me Too is accompanied by an accusation. That it's not just a truth about myself, but it's actually a truth about someone else, and a calling to account of that someone else. And I think there are interesting questions we ought to be asking now about what sort of social movements evolve out of this truth-telling, this coming out of the closet as being someone who's experienced sexual assault or harassment. And I want us to be sure that we're thinking not only about getting justice, but building power. How do we build a power, a movement based in power among all of us who either have or will or may experience sexual assault or harassment, or could be the people who commit those acts? Rather than only turning to the police or to institutional authorities to fix it.
Abdul, I'd be curious, we talk about when you question someone's story as they're coming forward. As a journalist, we are trained to fact check, and we're supposed to take someone at face value, but also, verify. And yet I also know that can be very painful for someone who's coming forward and saying, this is my story. How do you balance those, obviously, those directives that we need to move forward on?
For me, everything comes down to goals and what are we doing and why we're doing it, right? And so in your profession as a journalist, yes, you have to fact check X and Y and Z, make sure everything lines up, right? But if I'm a friend and my friend comes forward, my job isn't to be a journalist. My job is to be a support and a friend and a human to that person. And oftentimes when survivors come forward, they don't even get the journalist side saying, let me fact check this. They get the I am immediately skeptical side of this, whether or not they know the person who committed the harm or not. And so for me, that's another loss, if you will, for survivors, because not only did you go through something really horrific, but now your support system doesn't even trust you or love you or show that empathy for you and can give you some of those things that you might need to get through the day or get through the process, right? So many times we have to help people, heal themselves, but also learn how to heal their support systems and find out who they can go to for trust, and whether it's a professor or a friend or a colleague. So we have to help survivors do almost double the work.
Sarah, I'd be curious what you think about this, the use of social media. I mean, Kate Upton was a very high-profile example of somebody who came out on social media making an accusation against Paul Marciano, the founder of Guess. Thoughts on that?
Well, Guess has taken a major hit as a result of that, and I think it's interesting that in an industry like the modeling industry, where models are the faces of big multinational companies, I think these companies need to take a long, hard look at how they're going to avoid reputational risk going forward. And in our industry, it's an industry that essentially relies on, everyone's a freelancer. There is no HR department. And most people don't know how to report, where to report. So that's one of the things that we've done at the Model Alliance, is set up a discrete grievance reporting service. And we want to make that more robust and build that out, working with various industry stakeholders. But this can't just be about companies sort of, at the end of the day, protecting themselves and being concerned about their own liability. I think all different stakeholders, from brands, media companies, agencies, and so on, need to work together to make sure that we have all the elements of a program in place, so that there's proper complaint mechanisms, so that there's education. Just having good policies are not going to be enough.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, we talked about not wanting to question a survivor, and triggering those feelings of shame, but also there's as a legal scholar, the question of due process. And I'd be curious if you have concerns moving forward, or even with some of what's transpired.
Well, just to respond to what Sarah said, I think one of the things that you're seeing on social media is the failure of law. I think what you're seeing is most human resources departments don't handle sexual harassment complaints in ways that feel satisfying or responsive to the survivors themselves. And so this has largely moved outside of law, and I think is a response to the failures of sexual harassment law. Leaving that to the side for a moment, if you think about harassment, and I do think about harassment, it's not just about the offensive touching or the offensive conduct, but about a true imbalance of power between two people, and recognizing that often it is men who hold the most power, and white men at that, who hold most power. I think if you think about it in those terms, you can't help but be slightly concerned about the casual dismissal of due process. I worry, not necessarily because I don't believe other women, because I know this happens all of the time, but I would worry about what other vulnerable populations might be targeted when we carelessly dismiss the idea that you do have to verify, that you do have to fact check, that there may be two very different points of view here. And that's something that I've been really interested in watching as this has unfolded, because the immediate response has been a rush to expulsion. And in some accounts, it seems like that's exactly right. Like there are multiple accounts of poor conduct. But then in other circumstances, you just sort of wonder, what do you do if this in fact isn't the way that someone has thought it unfolded, or that there are two very different views of what actually happened?
If I could just build on this, because I agree entirely with basically everything Melissa ever says, but particularly, we have other lessons or examples of where this is an issue in bullying policies and hate speech policies in the universities, but also in high schools and middle schools. Those policies are great on paper, but overwhelmingly they've been enforced disproportionately against men of color and boys of color. And so due process is enormously important because there's more than one bias or form of wrong going on in almost any context we live and work or learn in. Racism is always present, as is sexism, homophobia, a wide range of forms of bias. And so we want to be sure that we're careful, that we keep an eye on the ways in which these policies or these accusations can end up empowering some at the expense of others.
I want to get a little bit at the idea of Me Too as a catalyst. Me Too as a catalyst for social movements, either parallel social movements or directly within sexual harassments. Feel free, any of you. Yes, go for it. Yeah.
So I think that we need to rely on women more, not only to call out the forms of injury and reveal the forms of injury they suffered, but also to talk about what kind of sex we want, not just the kind of sex we don't want. I think we're pretty clear in many circumstances on what that is. But I'd like to see a kind of social movement where we take sex and sexuality back into our own hands. Not as a prohibition in sight only of injury, but also as a place of pleasure. And particularly in a campus like Columbia's, I would love to see students commit themselves to a culture of sexual pleasure, delight, experimentation, and forms of yes, along with the forms of no. And certainly it's not the faculty that should do that.
That sounds great, although I've heard... Really? I thought that would be an excellent way of... You know, we did a consent show from Penn State, and there were people talking about affirmative consent. And, you know, can I touch you here? Can I touch you here? And that all sounded good until everyone left the room and people were rolling their eyes and saying, that is not sexy.
No.
So what is where do we go? And what is, Melissa says you wrote a seminal article called, maybe that was a bad choice of words, but theorizing. Theorizing, yes. Mm-hmm. You want to give us a executive summary?
Well, I have some of my students in the room. I can call on them and ask them to talk about it. I mean, I don't want to dominate the discussion here, but I think law is good at no. Law is good at punishing. Law is good at line drawing. It's not so good at figuring out yes. And so to the extent that we over-rely on legal responses to this problem, and the law needs to be on the scene for sure, we sometimes neglect the yes side. And that's where I think political movements can be so important, of filling in what can be a kind of carceral disciplinary response to this problem, where women's sexual pleasure just sort of is, roadkill, if you will. It's just not something we focus on. And I think let's not neglect that piece too.
So Abdul, I'm not going to put you on the spot about women's sexual pleasure.
Please
but,
don't.
Oh, come on.
Well, I'll say this. We don't focus on women's sexual pleasure, but we do focus on men's sexual pleasure, right? And that becomes...
Well pivoted.
Right, so we talk about sex. It automatically, maybe inherently feels like we are at the forefront talking about how can we please men. And then if women benefit, well then that's great. Like that's great, but it's about men first and foremost. So yes, you're right. We need to bring people from all gender identities into the conversation in terms of talking about how can we make this thing called sex pleasurable for each other, as opposed to just for the male species, if you will, and then women have to kind of figure it out at some point along the way.
But let me toss another question in for you. There's a healthy number of men here. We talk about how this movement, if it's going to go forward in a healthy way, needs to have men, not just a few good men, but many men. What role can men play in your work? You talk about bystanders. Why is that so important, and how can men play a role?
So how or why can men be part of the solution? Well, that's one primary reason, because men are primarily the problem. And I'm not saying that as a way of saying all men commit assault. No, not at all. Look at the numbers of all sexual dating violence. About 90% are committed by men. So what does that mean? Well, let's educate our men. Let's raise the awareness of our men. Let's equip our men with skills to not commit dating and sexual assaulting violence. And maybe, fingers crossed, we'll have better luck with not having sexual dating and stalking violence. So what role can men play? Well, a few things. One, men can learn what not to do by looking at what the Harvey Weinsteins of the world have done, right? So a lot of times when I meet with men, we want we try to say to ourselves, well, who can we aspire to? Father, grandfather, uncle, and that's great. But we can also look at creating your own roadmap of the man that you want to become by looking at what has not worked already. Harvey Weinstein does not work. Aziz Ansari does not work. So now you got two not works. Now make a roadmap of what you think might work and kind of try that out, right? We also can learn by listening, and this is specifically for cisgender heterosexual men that are attracted to women, obviously, right? So listen to the women in your lives. Like, what do they want? What do they find to be pleasurable? What kind of movies do they like? If your girlfriend is saying, hey, I want to go watch Dirty Dancing on Broadway, don't take her to see Black Panther. Like, it's not that hard of a concept to do, right? And so I feel
I think those two are mutually exclusive.
Well,
just
no.
FYI.
No, not at all. What I'm saying is, many times in the romantic sense, the men said, Aziz Ansari wanted to get his needs met, not listening to what his partner's needs were. So when I say listen, I'm thinking about listening of what their needs are, and how can I help you meet those needs while also meeting my needs as well. So listening, and finding your own way, I think, are two good starts.
Melissa has a thought.
Well, I just want to sort of marry Katherine's comment and Abdul's comments together. I mean, I think one of the things the Aziz Ansari episode reveals is that we have fundamentally different ways of sexually socializing men and women in our society, and there needs to be more attention to women about empowering them to sort of embrace their sexuality, and also with men to assert a healthier vision of masculinity. And to be clear, I don't think healthy masculinity or toxic masculinity is confined to Me Too. I mean, the Parkland shootings, the president, I mean, we have tons of examples of the harms that toxic masculinity can do, and a need to sort of reclaim a healthy understanding of what it means to be a man in this culture.
Sara, feel free to throw your thoughts in on this, but also I'll direct you a little bit in the sense that I know that you've also worked to regulate age restrictions on labor and modeling. Give us a sense of what's happening there and why.
Well, when we looked at the laws on the books 6 years ago, we saw that models who are under 18 years old didn't have labor protections. I think that we're not even seen as workers, per se. And so we championed legislation to correct that. Kind of stepping back, I think women's visibility in a world where youth and beauty and sexuality are valued, but leadership is not, gives us a false sense of influence and parity. And I think that in working with some of the most visible women in the world, in the fashion industry, that my hope is that they would be made truly visible. These women who are visible should be in an empowered role. And if you're dealing with people who are working without even the most basic protections, who don't have much of a voice in their work, who are being objectified and sexually abused, and these are people who are even in the top 1% of their profession, what does that say for those who are far less visible?
I'd be curious how society links Me Too with other movements, whether it's addressing cultural gaps, whether it's Time's Up, which looks at other industries and other socioeconomic strata, or even pay equity issues to address differences that are going on in the workplace in terms of power imbalance. Melissa.
So I think this is a really important moment for Me Too to move beyond simply identifying violators, actually sort of think about how to create systemic change in not just the entertainment industry, but elsewhere. I mean, the politics of shame in this movement have been so palpable, so turn it in a more broad way. You've expelled Harvey Weinstein, but yet his brother is still the guy greenlighting movies at the Weinstein Company. Interrogate that. Like, what about women being in positions of power? Like, maybe we would have a different kind of workplace culture if women not only got paid what men paid, but also had the opportunity to be in the same roles that men have traditionally been in. And that to me seems like a really important opportunity that this movement could really capture and do much with.
I read a book called Better Together, and it looked at the case study of Uber after the founder was kicked out following sexual harassment claims, and they brought in a high-powered law professor to make things straight and come up with policy. And she said, here's the policy. Hire women at senior levels and pay them the same, because it empowers them. And the idea that that was her policy prescription seemed sort of revolutionary, and yet not at all. So I'm curious where this goes in terms of other industries, other sectors, social movements.
Well, we've seen in a number of other contexts, whether it's in corporate boards or national legislatures or parliaments in the political area, many places have tried quotas, where they require a certain number of women on corporate boards or a certain number of women in political office. And interestingly enough, long term, it turns out that the policies those women issue are not all that different in many cases than the ones that were there before, partly because the kinds of women that are being chosen are ones that replicate in many respects the kinds of power come through the kind of pipelines that the men who held those positions before. So, you know, I'm really happy to let women run things for a little while. Let's just see how it works. The men have sort of screwed things up rather royally, so why not let it be our turn? But you know, I think just having women's bodies in the room, well paid, may not be enough in the longer run. We also need to see a deeper critique and a deeper way of restructuring the business model of how we run these industries, so that exploitation isn't in the interest of the business itself. And I think in your business, you've described that, Sara, so well, that the exploitation of the people who are the face of these multi-gazillion-dollar industries are set up to be exploited. So how would you reorganize the business itself as opposed to only putting women at the top? I don't, that's a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer it. I know
well, I can give you some fodder if you want, Sara. I was saying to Sara right before we stepped on stage that I think it was last week or the week before, I spent the day with Sports Illustrated Swimsuit Edition folks and the cover model, and who's all of 22. And their view is that they're all in favor of body positivity, and that they put Ashley Graham on the cover, and they had this nude section this year that was spearheaded creatively by women. Women came up with the idea. They were the DP, the director of photography, the creative idea behind it. The women chose their own words that they were going to be painted with. And I remember interviewing Rose McGowan, and she said, you know, I grew up in Italy. I have no problems with nudity, but I was forced to do this one sex scene, and I felt very uncomfortable because I was being forced to do something, and so the nudity felt very shameful. And she started to cry, and she said that was, you know, a moment to me where she felt like she didn't have control of the process. So I'm curious if you think that that plays a role at all in terms of women and the way they are seen.
Sure, yeah, I mean, currently there is no policy of informed prior consent for jobs involving nudity. Condé Nast recently issued a code of conduct, which I think is a good first step, and that's one of the provisions of the code. And so the model has to sign off in advance. But we're talking about an industry and a culture where it's not unusual for like teenage girls, and I speak from personal experience, to be expected to stand around nude without so much as a bathrobe around hundreds of people on a set. You know, it wasn't actually until this past New York Fashion Week that we were able to get private changing rooms, or not even private changing rooms, individual stalls, but just a curtain. And it took us 6 years to get that. I mean, you wouldn't think that's too much to ask when you have any number of random people back there, photographers, stylists, hairdressers, makeup artists, random hangers-on. And this is in an environment where you have, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids. So if it's been that difficult just to get a curtain hung up backstage, imagine how much work we have left to do to ensure that we have basic rights and protections and systems in place to address these concerns.
Fascinating. Abdul, I'm curious how the Me Too movement has impacted your work in preventing sexual violence.
Well, if I can just maybe touch on a point that
Please
Sarah had
do.
mentioned. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of bystander awareness, or rather bystander intervention, but also media literacy, right? And so also thinking about, well, for Sports Illustrated swimsuit, who's also consuming that media, right? So that's a huge part of who gets to dictate who's on the cover, how they look, what position they're in, right? And so the last time I checked, it was geared for men, yeah. And so that's why we see women in these scantily clad outfits on said cover, right? And so I can't help but go back to, because men are the consumers, in some ways we're driving what gets put on the cover. So would a woman choose to be on the cover in a bikini had it not been for men? I don't know, but it feels like men are driving the bus here. And so that idea of that toxic masculinity of always needing to see women in this sexy, objectified light now becomes part of the media. And so that's one thing that we try to help in our workshops, help our students break down, is not only what media do you consume, but also how are you deconstructing that media to find out who's benefiting, who's not, whose story is being told and who's not. So that's one thing I want to add there.
And just FYI, I asked our research department to pull the number of covers that had women on Sports Illustrated the other weeks of the year, and it turned out there were two. Their covers featuring women, and one of them had more than one person on the cover. So to your point, I think it's still very much men driving the bus. Melissa?
I mean, the other thing that we ought to think about is making this movement more inclusive. One of the critiques of Me Too is that the focus has been on actresses, on very high-profile women who are incredibly well-resourced, when in fact, the women who are most likely to be subjected to sexual predation or coercion in the workplace are women who work in low-wage industries, and they have been remarkably absent in this conversation. So that's something we need to think about. The voices of women of color, Lupita Ngoyo and Salma Hayek wrote beautifully written essays in the New York Times about their treatment at the hands of Harvey Weinstein, received far less coverage than the words of other women who also, I mean, and it's not the oppression Olympics, but it is a repeating, again, about power, who holds power and who doesn't. And you know, there is a kind of hierarchy being manifested, and it's the same hierarchy we see with white men at the top and people of color and women of color at the bottom.
I was struck as Sarah was talking about the issue of the curtain and how hard it is to develop a culture of safety also. In context where you're really describing sex work, legalized sex work, and the connections between that context and people who are engaged in criminalized sex work, where the New York Police Department seizes condoms as evidence on people that they arrest on a suspicion of engaging in sex work, and often they're condoms issued by the New York City Health Department. So if you have, you don't have your bag with you right now, but say you had 3 or 4 condoms in your bag, that would be evidence that you were engaging or planning to engage in sex work. And that's not that far away from the curtain. And I think we need to see ways of connecting the dots between sexual exploitation and vulnerability and safety in legalized industries and industries where women are rendered more vulnerable by the criminalization of the kinds of work that they do, and how race also structures those contexts of safety and exploitation.
Right. And just to dovetail off what Melissa was saying, that is part of what the Time's Up movement is doing, is producing this fund to allow others in other perhaps less resourced industries to file claims and to have some of their expenses touched on. I want to include the audience more in this conversation. So I'm going to go to you a little bit earlier because I kind of want to know what you're thinking and take a pulse of thoughts. So there's a microphone in the back. I want you to gather your thoughts, think about what, if anything, is missing from this discussion. We're going to take 3 quick questions and then we'll launch it back to the audience. Anyone? Oh, hands. You want to go to the back and then, yeah, go ahead. Start with you. Yep.
Hi, I was just, I was just wondering whether you could touch on the current embedded norms or the cultural embedded norms that are preventing us from having the So, okay, let me. In talking about how the Me Too movement is really a reflection of the current structures and the privileges, and how people of color and women don't have the access or the privilege to be able to speak up in the ways that women have been over the last. Women in higher positions have been in the different industries. I was wondering what it is that we can do to address the cultural embedded norms on a day-to-day basis in disrupting those structures.
Okay, cool. That's one. I saw another hand in the middle. Yes. Yep. Well, both of you. Well, you can hand the microphone to the gentleman, and then he can pass it forward to Rose.
Hi.
And can you say your name and your affiliation, if you don't mind?
Okay, my name is David. I'm from the Columbia University School of Social Work.
Nice.
I want to touch on what somebody said earlier about people, white men in power, and the hierarchy, and how the deconstruction of what's right, what's wrong, but it's always covered with power. So with that is oppression with privilege at the same time. So I want to say is like, how is it that we as students and others can try to shift the momentum to address that if people in power who are like our political leaders, like the president and others who have been doing all these things in DC, how are we going to have them held accountable for their actions? Because at the same time, we are looking towards them for leadership and direction. So if I as an American see a man like that do that, I'm going to think that's right, even though it's wrong, because I have 4 sisters and I have a mother. And the way I was brought up, I learned how to respect women. That's why I am who I am today. But that's my question.
Okay. And can you pass it in front of you to Rose? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dorothy Grant, and I am in the School of General Studies. So my question is that there's obviously a double standard and in sexuality where nudity in men is much more desexualized, and our attempt is to desexualize women as well. With this, you mentioned Sports Illustrated where they're posing nude and they choose what they're wearing, but sexuality in women is still something that is very common, and once a woman is nude, she's immediately like objectified for it. And there's a huge pressure out there, even though there are those contracts before that you mentioned saying that before you have to sign off if you know there's going to be nudity. Once you're at the set or even before signing, there's must be a lot of pressure to sign to be able to achieve, because we see these people out there that have achieved and they have a magazine cover nude themselves. So how do we show that leadership in saying, no, I don't want to pose nude is okay, and still be able to be on the cover without agreeing to do that?
Okay, great. Those are great questions. Who wants to attack the patriarchy first? Okay, we'll go. And then we'll have somebody else address sexuality, objectification.
You go
ahead.
I was just, yes, I would like to.
Me too, I'm
smash
just
the
signing up for
patriarchy.
the program.
I thought you were just asking for volunteers.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think your questions actually relate to each other in important ways. And I don't mean, when I talk about this hierarchy, I don't mean to say like I hate white men or white people. I don't. I'm like, I have lots of white friends. But if you can't see the power dynamic in our society, you're not really looking, because I see it all of the time. Like, I'm raising 2 children. I have to go to such great lengths to show my Black daughter images of herself in social media. We have seen Black Panther 7 times. I don't even really like it. But I think I have to show her that there are beautiful Black women who look like her, because I can't find those images anywhere. And that might be in part because what the modeling industry is like, what the fashion industry is like, what the media industry is like. But it's obvious to me. And how do we change that? I think we can be different consumers of these products. I think one of the things Black Panther has done is show there is a market for people who want to see images of Black people that are not completely denigrated, right? We have this joke in our family. we buy every American Girl doll that is put out when she's black. So we bought Melody, we bought Addie the Slave, we bought the Girl of the Year last year. I mean, we have them all because my husband is like, if we don't buy it, then they're not going to make more of them because they don't think that there's a market. And I'm just like, well, with that kind of logic, that's how we wound up seeing The Best Man Holiday in the theater. But I mean, like, being an active consumer of that, and you know, another way of being a good ally is thinking about your own consumption patterns and what you might do differently. I mean, it's like a very basic way that you might do it. The other way you might smash the patriarchy is with your voice. I mean, I think what the students at Parkland are doing in Florida right now is incredibly powerful and really resonant. And you know, I'd like to see more young people and more middle-aged people do the same thing as well.
I think it is incredibly important. I think there is quietly work being done because a movie like Pink Panther doesn't get made overnight. It's been thought about and sorry, Black Panther. Thank you very much.
That's the gay version.
That's the gay version, yeah. Very funny. But also, at the same time, on the same studio set was Wrinkle in Time, this movie that I went to go do. And it was a children's classic written in the 60s that the star girl who saves the universe happens to be biracial. And Ava DuVernay made that conscious decision, and Disney was like, fine. And there was no mention made in the movie of an interracial marriage or a biracial child. Same with, I've interviewed Shonda Rhimes. You know, her characters are not black doctors, they are doctors who happen to be black, and the mention of their blackness is almost like not even really relevant to what they do. And I think the more that is normalized in a cultural sense is really important. And of course, we went around Tarnation finding Barbie dolls because the 3 Barbie dolls of Wrinkle in Time, Oprah, Mindy, and Reese Witherspoon were made, and I showed it to Mindy. It was the first time she had seen it, and Oprah was so excited playing doll, and she was saying this is an anatomically correct Barbie, which was another sort of representation idea that was very powerful in the moment. And Mindy said, how many South Asian Barbie dolls are there? I don't even know, I may be the first one. But let's talk about the other question, which is objectification and how we get around that.
Well, and I think that your question is related to what you were discussing. Certainly in our industry, and in Hollywood, there are problems around sort of tokenism. And I think that if people are being treated more like props, you know, bodies to be objectified, or, you know, you're the sort of token, you know, person of color in a cast of mostly white models, then of course it's reductive. And I think if people are not actually treated as creative partners, as creative equals, that you're gonna, you know, it's gonna be difficult to break that cycle. So that is bigger than just a labor issue. That requires a massive shift in sort of how we view people who are, you know, not just faces but also considered creative equals in these industries.
So there's something that Melissa said that I want to pick up on, and that is this idea of the perfect victim, right? And that is this idea that the perfect victim, in terms of, I'll speak for sexual violence specifically, is that they're a woman and that they're white and that they have no flaws. And by no flaws, I mean they didn't dress too provocatively, they didn't drink too much, they didn't go out till late at night, they study a lot, they go to Columbia, you know, they whatever, right? And so this idea that when women of color are victimized, now we can attach a whole bunch of baggage or claims as to why they got victimized, right? When it's someone who identifies as gay or queer victimized, now we can attach a whole bunch of stuff as to why they got victimized. But there's one sort of ilk over here we call it perfect victim in my office, right? Of this is the people whose story gets told, whose stories we all buy and say, hey, I'm gonna feel bad for this person. But these people over here, the Toronto Burks of the world, the young girl from Brooklyn of the world, their stories don't get told. We don't feel that collective remorse for them. And so I think and so in terms of what can we do? Well, we can start by when someone comes forward and say, hey, I was victimized, whether I'm a male or female, or I'm gay, I'm queer, whatever, we can start by doing what? Supporting that person. to make sure that their story gets told just as equally, just as well, just as loud as that perfect victim.
I have to say, I thought that was one of the more refreshing moments was when the African-American actor, whose name suddenly escapes me, talked about the agent in Hollywood who...
Terry Crews.
Terry Crews. I thought that was an incredibly eye-opening moment in that, exactly speaking to that point. So thank you for that. Thoughts?
I just wanted to speak to the first question having to do with a culture of embedded norms, and then linking it to some of the other issues that others of you raised. Is we live in this time where our political leaders, the most prominent one in the White House, seems to be able to act without impunity on any matter. It doesn't really, sexual harassment being one of them, or assault being one of them, but nothing seems to be unsayable anymore. And I think it's important to view him in relationship to Mike Pence, because what we've lost is a sense of moral leadership from our public officials and delegated to the domain of religion, the problem of, or the task of carrying the water for morality. And I think we need to find a way to again imbue public service with the sense of morality, maybe not religious morality, but public morality. That's what's so inspiring, I think, about these kids in Florida, is they're coming forward, taking up public space and saying, we need a different morality around guns. Not just more not just laws that are different, but actually see this in a different way. And that's so encouraging. But it's an answer, I think, to the kind of empty morality of someone like Donald Trump, together with, I think, Mike Pence, who stands for a kind of religious alternative to the state. So.
That's great. Okay, let's get 3 more questions, because I love hearing from the audience. And while we're getting the microphone over to you, the other thing that struck me about Terry Crews is it crystallized for so many of us the idea that this was about sexualized hostility. This was about degrading somebody and humiliating them, and that was something that was so visceral in him coming forward. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tim. I'm from engineering, and I'm wondering, how do you see the role of labor unions in combating sexual harassment, whether for models, manufacturing, or say graduate students?
Graduate students. That's a great question. Thank you. Unions. Okay, 2 more. These 2 I'll picture, and then we'll go that way. Okay.
I'm Sara Ziff. I'm a professor at Rutgers and a visiting scholar with Professor Franke's center. So I wanted to ask what you all thought about this paradox that we seem to be seeing, and you touched upon it in different ways. So on the one hand, you see this president and parts of his administration, some of whom have now been kicked out of the White House, who are offending women in ways that, at least overtly, in ways we've never seen before. But on the other hand, you're also seeing young people and women come out and defend democracy. So you have this anti-democratic phenomena coming from those in power, but you also have this very populist democratic movement coming from women, minorities, and also the alt-right even, arguably. And so how do you explain, or how do you see this paradox of defending women's rights, but also offending and violating women's rights?
Great question. And right here.
Hi, I have a comment/question. So I am a junior at the School of General Studies, and I'm also a non-binary runway model. So I definitely feel what Sara says about changing clothes without a private space, which I did like 2 weeks ago. So I also agree with Professor Katherine Franke's idea of involving men to move forward this movement, because I see there are a lot of things at stake for men as well. It's not just their reputation, it's not just their business and money, it's also their body, their boy's body, their children's body. And how do we like make other men realize, okay, so even your body is very desexualized, you can also, you know, be molested, be offended, be part of this group of Me Too. And I think that's part of the critical issue to dismantle the patriarchy system, because once we make men realize that they have as much at stake as all the rest of the population, they will feel the transition of power from themselves to spread across the system. And also, I feel like as a gay man in the gay community, I think you don't have to be sexually attracted to women in order to harass women, because I've seen plenty of misogyny and disrespect towards women in gay male space. And I think to win over men, especially to win over gay men, we need to educate and spread the message. Thank you.
Thank you for all those questions. Fielder's choice.
Maybe I'll start, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I think that there's certain questions that I try to keep in my mind, and I would ask us to keep in our minds as well collectively, right? And that is, what is the value in men? Because you're speaking about speaking about the president previously. What is the value in men to not commit sexual assault, right? So right, because if you do, you can be president of the United States. So why should I not do that, right? So I mean, I can be Harvey Weinstein, I can be Aziz Ansari, I can be whomever and make a lot of money and still do all these things. So why should I not? So in terms of like how do you get there, I think because we live in a capitalistic society, in many ways it comes down to cost. How can we affect the pocketbooks or the pockets of the people in power? That's one thing. But another thing too is I'm a big sports person. So I think that now we are in a generation where we are becoming more, we are evoking healthier coaching options for students and for teams, right? Where we're not yelling, we're not being that toxic, hyper-masculine, go run 30 laps and do 20 push-ups. It's healthier, it's, how are you feeling right now? It's more getting in people's heads, right? And I think that if we can take some of that stuff and spill it over to the political arena, to the education arenas, to make it so that we have men and women together at the table, it produces a healthier alternative for all of us, and not just a win for men. Because as I said now, it's a win for men.
Interesting. Labor unions, paradox, either of you guys?
Yeah, there was a question about unions, and when I first started doing this work, I approached established unions and explained my and other people's concerns about systemic sexual abuse. And we were turned away. We were told that they would not be able to accept us into membership. And part of that is because of as independent contractors were unable to unionize. So that's why we have sort of been forced to experiment and develop new models. And I don't know, I mean, my experience with the sort of traditional unions has been that they tend to be very older, white, male dominated, and these are not the people who are going to be on the front lines of addressing concerns around Me Too. So I would like not only to inject a labor consciousness into my industry, but also perhaps inject a consciousness around women, particularly young women's concerns, into the labor movement.
Interesting. Melissa, you had a thought?
Sarah's point about being unwelcome in the unionized labor area is so interesting. I mean, again, it's the sort of failure of law. You don't fit the model for organized labor, so you have to go outside of law and that model to create something else. I mean, and that's exactly what Me Too is doing. And maybe that's the answer to your question. What can people of your generation do? I mean, we have these established structures, and some of them are failing. Like, how do we go outside of them? What is the way to go outside of that?
I'd be curious. I just interviewed Gloria Allred recently, and she said part of the reason why she goes so hard in the court of public opinion is because precisely that. The court of law doesn't work for the Cosby accusers, for example, with the statute of limitations. But she went to try to change laws within certain jurisdictions to extend those. Where are those areas, whether it's sexual harassment law or other case law, that might be able to push the envelope, do you think?
Well, so, I mean, one of the interesting things, the responses to Me Too, is that it perhaps might shine a light on why law is failing and prompt reform. And, lots of people have been talking about legislative policy changes that could be made to strengthen sexual harassment law. So that's actually an encouraging part of it. But again, I mean, Katherine is exactly right. Law's great at no, and there's definitely some no needed here. But as she says, like, there's also an opportunity to think more positively and generatively about the kind of sexual culture we want, the kind of workplace culture we want, and that can't be on law alone.
Have you been following Gretchen Carlson's push for some of these, the kind of de facto NDAs that happen because of collective bargaining? Do you want to tell the audience about that?
So I don't know at Gretchen Carlson's point, the NDA situation is really interesting. I was just on this call for a law firm that's developing practice and how to respond to sexual harassment, not to necessarily defend, but to sort of change workplaces. And one of the things they talked about were the dangers of NDAs.
What's an NDA?
So an NDA is a non-disclosure agreement. So generally when a sexual harassment claim is settled, both parties will sign a non-disclosure agreement agreeing not to disclose the nature of the conduct and how they've agreed to settle it. Me Too has sort of undermined all NDAs. I mean, NDAs are kind of pointless at this point if people are just, you know what, I'm taking my complaint to the court of public opinion. So there's been, I think, in a lot of legal practices, a reassessment of how you will deal with non-disclosure agreements, if at all. There's also been, in the current tax law, a shift to employers can no longer write off the cost of settling sexual harassment claims, which I think on its face looks like a really positive move, except if you take into account that a lot of survivors of sexual harassment may not want to come forward. They actually want to settle their claims and they want to move on with their lives. Now employers really don't have incentives to settle, and again, the lack of NDAs also removes some of those incentives. So to the extent that there are people who are not able to harness Me Too and stand as a collective but are still individuals, you might worry about that aspect, the isolation that they will continue to experience.
It's fascinating. I think there's kind of two types of NDAs that are in the rarefied world of like Hollywood and Silicon Valley. You sign a sort of mutually binding non-disclosure agreement. But in larger corporations, where if you work for a big company and you accuse someone of sexual harassment, they quickly put you into collective bargaining, and when they reach a settlement, they make you sign sort of basically a de facto NDA, which is what Gretchen Carlson is going after. We have 5 minutes left, so if you have any thoughts on the paradox or anything, feel free, and then I just want to give you a moment to have some closing thoughts so we can end on time.
Well, I don't want to leave all of y'all with this sense that law's over here and culture's over there, and that law, judges and juries and the legal system is somehow inoculated from what's going on in social media and in your world on the streets. The standard of liability in sexual harassment cases is basically what is reasonable under the circumstances. It's a very fuzzy standard. In the criminal context, it's not hugely different. And so what counts as reasonable in the legal context is affected by how we change that norm in the streets and in social media. So the law will move to follow, I think, where we go as a society. So yes, law is best at no, but we can change where no can actually do work by how we talk about it publicly or we talk about it in social media, and we should be doing that. And I have lots to say on this paradox, and you and I will have coffee this afternoon and talk about it.
Closing thoughts, paradox, if you feel like it. No pressure either way.
I hear you. So closing thoughts. One, we can begin by putting survivors at the forefront of our conversations, right? I mean, that's what this movement has been, will be, and was rooted in, right? That's kind of but that is one thought. Another thought is that I'm going to put this back on you, the audience. And I don't say that tongue-in-cheek or in a coy or sarcastic way, but thinking about the students down in Florida and what they were able to do, I could not have imagined that they would take to this kind of social media movement. So I was going to put it back on you and say, hey, where do you want the country to go, and how can you use your power as a student, as an undergrad or a grad, as a GS student, to take the country or take Columbia even where you want it to go, right? So how can you do that? And the last thing I'll say is, In terms of engaging men, I'm going to say let's not give up that fight. Let's continue to have those conversations where the stats and the data and all that like hard science stuff doesn't work. Then go to the emotional side of it. When that doesn't work, go back to the stats side, right? So let's attack this problem, if you will, of engaging men from a two-pronged approach.
I failed to mention that we actually introduced a bill recently to extend protection against sexual and other forms of harassment to models. And obviously, having laws on the books is not the only way to address these concerns, but at the moment, because we're all freelancers, accountability is very confused. And so I do think that that's an important step. I also wonder if we need to think about sort of what justice looks like. And in my experience, people who come to my organization reporting concerns about harassment and assault very rarely want to go fill out a police report. In some cases, I think they would rather know that the person who abused them just wouldn't do it again, or maybe would offer a public apology, or and I think that maybe we need to think more about, again, like what justice looks like.
That's such a good thought. If you want to jump in with an additional thought on what justice looks like, it's a great segue to a closing thought.
Again, I think all of this comes back to just the basic power dynamics that structure our society. And Sarah's right. What does a more just society looks like? I think we're all suggesting that maybe it looks like power is redistributed in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Brilliant. I think the best panel is the kind of panel that ends on time. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking your precious time out of your academic day to hang with us and listen to these brilliant people's thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, wow, how incredible was that panel? So I have 3 asks for you, and then I'll ask you again to join me in thanking our wonderful conversationalists. The first is that we are going today or tomorrow to post the video from this conversation to University Life's YouTube channel. I'd ask and encourage you to please share it widely. These are conversations that everybody needs to hear. I think that you've covered such tremendous territory today. And so please, if you can do that, we would appreciate it. Second is if you have thoughts, reactions that you want to share with University Life, including for us to post on our social media, you can just send them to universitylife@columbia.edu or possibly DM us on our Instagram, although I can't really speak exactly how to do that. Third, a week from today, we're having another In Conversation, and this is with author and poet Claudia Rankine, Whitney Dow from Columbia's Oral History Project, and MSNBC's Joy Reid to talk about race and whiteness and culture in the United States. So that may be something you want to check out. There's registration on the University Life website for with your CUID. And finally, really please join me in thanking everyone again, Juju for being a fantastic moderator, and everybody for a wonderful conversation.